All right, welcome to our lecture for today, Monday, October 12th. We don't have art slides this week, so rather than that, I will be covering the first portion of our West in the World readings for this week. But to begin, we will go over a brief review of Exam 2. All of those grades are posted, so you should be able to see them on Canvas, along with some comments that I've left for each of you. And then we'll move on to our lecture to introduce the Roman Empire. And then that will be followed by a quiz that I will be posting on Canvas for you to take some time today. All right, so to review for our review exam 2, I have our prompt here again. Most of you did very well on this one. I was pleased to see that some of you had some very clear structure, which really helped to allow you to answer the question thoroughly. So our prompt for this exam says, the golden age of Athens is bookended by two wars with very different outcomes for Athens, the Persian Wars and the Peloponnesian War. Using art, theater, philosophy, and politics, discuss the changing conceptions of what it means to be human and live a good life during this period. So I'm going to review a few different potential outlines that you could have done for this essay. Again, there are many different ways that you could answer this question, so we're just going to look at a few possibilities to sort of get an idea of the range of options that were available to you and that will be available to you on your next exam. So again, having a really strong structure will go a long way to helping you answer the question well. Some of you had a lot of really great examples to answer this question, but you maybe were lacking on the structure, which meant that it was harder to get sort of a cohesive idea or the big picture that you were talking about. Whereas some of you had fewer examples, but you had a really strong structure, which meant that your examples were clear, you got straight to the point, and thoroughly answered the question without having to, sort of overexert yourself on your exam. So one potential way that you could outline this essay is sort of topical or thematically. So for a topical outline, of course, we're going to still just follow the same 5-paragraph pattern. For your introduction, pretty simple. You just want to restate the question, which again just shows me that you have thoroughly considered each part of the question. You know what you need to do to answer it. And then you're going to want to give a thesis statement. So this is just some sort of position on the topic. Doesn't have to be really complicated or in depth. Just a simple thesis statement that you can continue to come back to with each point. And then you may want to go ahead and outline your points if you have them in mind at this point. A potential first point, if I were writing this essay, I might talk about politics to begin with, and I would move sort of just throughout the periods here. Start by talking about oligarchy, and then the rise of democracy after the Persian Wars, and then into some of the ways that different people questioned democracy. So you might talk about Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War. You might talk about some of our philosophers and the ways that they questioned the effectiveness of democracy. And then you go back into oligarchy, which was established by Sparta after Athens lost the Peloponnesian War. And then a second point that I would write would be art and theater. And so I would want to sort of draw out a few common themes of how things are changing over time during this period. So I might start with anthropocentrism and talk about, after Athens won the Persian War, we see a rise in anthropocentrism with this idea that, man can sort of do anything. We want to study man, figure out what this sort of ideal form is. But then moving into the Peloponnesian War, we begin to see that sort of being questioned. And we might look at themes of fate and free will in theater. and how that reflects maybe a shift away from anthropocentrism, or at least a questioning of anthropocentrism. And then for my third point, I would talk about philosophy. I would start with the sophists, in this idea that man is the measure of all things, then talk about Socrates' challenge to the sophists and the introduction of the Socratic method, and into Aristotelian observation, and this idea that our senses are everything. And again, that's just to show sort of the trajectory of thought and culture in Athens from this period of the Athenian Golden Age, from the Persian Wars into the Peloponnesian Wars. And then to conclude, I would restate my thesis, just to make sure it's really clear, summarize my points to show exactly how each of those points supports the thesis. But another potential way that you could outline this essay is in a sort of a chronological order. So obviously, by going thematically or topically, we're going to go back and forth. We're going to talk about, politics in early Athens to politics in late Athens. We're going to talk about art in early Athens to art in late Athens, and so on. But you might want to move a little more chronologically, and there are a few ways that you could do this. But again, with the intro, it's going to be pretty much the same. You just want to restate the question, provide a thesis statement, maybe summarize your points that are coming up. But one way that I could organize this chronologically would be to talk about the sort of the three plays that we have from Sophocles, and talk about them in order and sort of what they reveal about what's going on in Athens politically, culturally, philosophically. So I would start with Antigone, which was the earliest play. I would give a little explanation of the events of the play, and then maybe talk about how those events reveal what is happening in politics and philosophy at that time. And then I would move on to Oedipus the King, again, give a little explanation of the events, talk about its political and philosophical implications. So remember, Antigone is sort of coming about in the height of the Golden Age, and then Oedipus the King comes about right at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. So sort of two interesting contrasting points. And then lastly, we have Oedipus at Colonus, which is maybe a little more difficult since we didn't actually read it, but we did talk about it in class, and there are plenty of summaries out there. And so again, I'd give a little explanation and some of the political and philosophical alignments that come out of it, just as a way of sort of looking at what is the tone, what is the sort of sentiment in Athens at the end of the Peloponnesian War. And then I would again conclude by restating my thesis and summarizing my main points. So these are just a few different ways that you can outline this essay. There are lots of different ways. Some of you did things along these lines. Most of you did more of a topical or thematic outline. But again, this is a really great way to strengthen your essay, to make sure that you are thoroughly answering the question that is given to you for each exam. So keep this in mind as you study for exam 3 in a few weeks. We will continue to sort of return to these ideas to help you all improve your essays. All right, so now we are moving on to our introduction to the Roman Republic, which will become the Roman Empire. So here's a quick timeline. 753 BCE is the founding of Rome. This isn't an exact date. This is just an estimation according to legend and archaeological evidence. And then it's in 509 BCE that we have the creation of the Roman Republic. So it moves from just a city or monarchy into a more organized form of government. 338 BCE, we have the settlement of the Latin War. And then from 264 to 146 BCE, we have the Punic Wars, which we won't get into today. All right, so the founding of Rome, as I already said, archaeological evidence confirms this date to be around 753 BCE. This is also, some legends suggest this time period as well. We don't know too much about what happened, but we do have a legendary story about what happened. So Aeneas is a hero of the Trojan War. and he manages to escape Troy before it is burned by the Greeks. And the story holds that Romulus and Remus were two twins born from the line of Aeneas. That their father was the god Mars, and that Romulus and Remus are sort of cast out, raised by wolves, and then Romulus ends up killing Remus and becomes the first king of Rome. And we'll talk about this more later, but this sort of story is how the Romans attempted to directly connect themselves to the Greeks, to say that they were descended from them, that Romulus and Remus were descendants of Aeneas. And so that's just sort of the legendary story behind it. What we know from archaeological evidence is that it seems that some outside tribe displaced some local tribes and established a settlement in what is now modern-day Rome, and that this settlement was comprised mostly of farmers. And again, we don't know too much about what was happening during this time period. But to the north of Rome, we have an area called Etruria, or the Etruscans. They appeared in Italy sometime around 800 BCE, so shortly before Rome was founded. They had a fairly wealthy civilization where they traded lots of luxury goods in the Mediterranean. One thing that's interesting that Aristotle noted about the Etruscans is that their women seem to have more freedom and seem to be on perhaps more equal footing with men in their civilization. But the Etruscans are important to the Romans for several reasons that we will see, but the Romans adopted a lot of Etruscan culture. So the Etruscans built fairly sophisticated sewer systems that the Romans used. We also see some architecture adopted from the Etruscans. This is particularly in their temples. We also get togas from the Etruscans, so we can thank the Etruscans for toga parties. And the Etruscan alphabet, which is a really important one for writing, of course, which is important to our understanding of history. All right, so after the founding of Rome, we have rule by an Etruscan dynasty for a while there. But the Roman aristocracy sought to overthrow the Etruscans, as typically happens. We see this happening in Greece as well at various points. The Roman aristocracy was able to sort of rally the people to their cause by this story of the rape of Lucretia. So the story goes that the son of the Etruscan king raped this Roman woman named Lucretia, and it was around this story that they sort of gained support to overthrow the Etruscans, which is just sort of an interesting thing to think about. It's something that we still do. We sort of get these, these stories that we maybe hype up to sort of get momentum for a particular cause, whether or not that story is embellished or not. Most people don't seem to care. They can get very excited about this sort of stories of injustice. And so that seems to be what happened here. So the patricians, which is just a fancy word for noble families in Rome, supported overthrowing the monarchy, mainly because the patricians were involved with the aristocracy and wanted more power. But it seems that the lower classes were not as in favor quite often, simply because they relied on the monarchy and the structure that it provided for them. All right, so it's around 509 BCE that we see the emergence of the Roman Republic. And this is when the aristocracy overthrew the Etruscan monarchy and established their own form of government. So republic just means public matter. And there's a really important distinction that we begin to see here between notions of the public and the private. So monarchies were seen as being private, sort of exclusive and closed off, but they wanted a public form of government that was available to all citizens. and that this sort of distinction between public and private is something that remains with us today and is an important way or important part of how our government and our